very honored indeed to be here, and very happy to share with you. Also, I have to say it is that I am very moved by your story of the 18-year-old who arrives in Puerto Rico. But I have to say also that I grew up in Rio Piedras, and I went to school there, and then I went to the university. And I come from a very large family, most of them from Gurabo and Caguas, and most of them had migrated in the 40s to New York. The question, where were you at that time? But it has more to do with the whole political colonial situation and with memory and history, more than I think. And now, one of the writers that I had the privilege of meeting and knowing a little bit, Jose Luis Gonzalez, he wrote one of the books that we're going to be showing here, El País de Cuatro Pisos, a four-storied country, a very important essay in 1980. But prior to that, he had written a very beautiful story that I recommend now more and more, Una caja de plomo que no se podía abrir, a leaden box that could not be opened, that nobody, and it refers to the Korean War, and that was very much part of the immediate legacy, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico and the price of the ticket, which was the Korean War. And even today, the Korean War is usually forgotten when we talk about Puerto Rico, with very few exceptions. And my first experience of death in the family when I was 9 or 10 years old was precisely the Korean, a cousin that died in Korea. And I would like to begin there, because I think that it is, and our friends have invited us here to talk really, it's a question about, the questions are questions of memory, history, yes, collective memory, and those are very important questions always and everywhere and anywhere. Where do we come from? Who are we? Those were the questions, and those are still the main questions, And individual memories, but also memorias, comunidad de memorias, collective memories. Who writes history? For whom? What is the role of the schools and history taught in the schools? History also as a question of policy. What are the policies in relation to history? And in the case of Puerto Rico, we had a very complex situation, because it was not just the Commonwealth, the Estado Libre Asociado, in my time already, but also the fact that it was a colony. So you have United States, the empire, and the way history is portrayed, or was not portrayed. So absences, a great deal of silencing, I would say. Silence more than anything else, Silence about the past, silence about the present. In that sense, Puerto Rico is no different, I have to say immediately too. I mean, the situation of Puerto Rico is not, it's very specific, but not different from many other countries, and of course not different from the United States either, where we have so many silences and silencing even today, And we just have to look around or try to listen what's happening today, and then we will understand. But it's the case of Haiti, it's the case of Cuba, before and after the revolution, silencing, the case of diasporas too. So it's a very important set of questions, not just one question. And I would say that while I was thinking about today, last week, I just happened to read an article in the current issue of Harper's Magazine by Louis Lapham, whom I like a lot as an essayist. I like essays too. And he was writing precisely about history and memory. And he quotes an essay that I had read a long time ago, and I was pleased to see that he had quoted it from George Orwell, the great British radical critic. Orwell said it very clearly, and the quote is the following: he who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. So that's a very important quote because it's a question of power too. Who has the power to write history? And who has the power to disseminate a vision of history? I like that here it was also phrased as resistance, because no matter how much power the powers that be have, there's also a way of replying. Not always, sometimes. And I think this is what happened in Puerto Rico in the 1960s and 70s and the 80s, but mainly in the 70s. There was a very significant change here in the diaspora and also in the island, a very significant change because there was a willingness to rediscover our own history. That's very important, for political reasons also, to have some control of our own lives. And that's, in my view, central. And why? Why? Because a lot of things were happening. First of all, you mentioned some of them, most of them, the Vietnam War, and Puerto Ricans were, they were forced to fight in the Vietnam War, just like in the Korean War. And the Vietnam War and the opposition to the war was absolutely important here for a new kind of political movement. But not only Vietnam, the civil rights movement. One can never underestimate the importance of the civil rights movement and the African American community and initiatives for our own communities. It was extremely influential in many, many ways. There were links, very deep links too, and that we have to recover also. The fact that the young lords were extremely important, not just here, but in the island as well, for the entire community, their political movement, and the need for a new history to sustain that political movement. But also, the context includes something that tends to be forgotten today, and it was so deeply entrenched in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora, McCarthyism, the Cold War, and the legacy of the Cold War. Puerto Rico was one of the most, in that case we have our own specific situation. The FBI documents that we know now reveal that since the 1930s, and Centro has made them available thanks to Congressman Serrano and others, I have been studying those documents, looking just at writers, it's shocking. Since 1934, that island and the community here too, in Chicago and in New York, was very closely followed everywhere, and reports were written every day, not just on Albizu campus, on many other independentistas, nationalists, socialists. That is a huge chapter of our history, no? And that's very specific to the Puerto Rican community. It's important to think about it today, where there are many other surveillance methods, very sophisticated, and where there are many other communities too under surveillance, or maybe we all are. No?
But it's sort of fascinating that there was still the attack on Congress.
Yes.
And that there was also the attempted assassination of Truman.
Yes, but it's also, but it's important.
All the surveillance.
But it's important to keep that in mind, because the climate, there was a chilling effect too. And I think that's why, even when I was at the university from 1957, 58 to 1962, some topics were just taboo. And it has a lot to do with surveillance, and it has a lot to do with control, no? Even at the university. And more so at the university than in other places. That's important. So, censorship, all kinds of censorship. But also, you're right, and I wanted to underline the fact that we're talking about a period here where you have incredible initiatives in the 1970s. Remember those years very closely linked. The same years, it is mentioned that CEREP, Centro de Estudios de la Realidad Puertorriqueña and its New History, was founded. So the same years that the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños, and let's not forget, el Museo del Barrio, no? Where the communities trying to create institutions for the memory of the community, for memory, no? no, it was not just the artists, it was the El Barrio, no? Trying to find ways of institutionalizing a new memory. And also, Hostos Community College. I remember, though, because I was in New York those years too, and I remember very well how I met people that were either founding Centro, they were all militants. Centro was not, looks like Hostos was not just an institution created by the city of New York. It was the result of militant groups trying very hard to create their own institutions, and that tends to be forgotten today. And therefore, a new history. No? So, new institutions for a new history. The artists play an important role, the musicians, not just the professors, no? Or the writers. This was a very significant movement of a whole community that became very active, and this I want to remember as well. And not, I would like to stress, not homogeneous, but heterogeneous. There were nationalists, socialists, communists, debates, internal debates, very heated debates. It was not by any means a homogeneous Puerto Rican movement in the island or here as well. It was full of tensions, as it should be, of different ideas, how to not only act politically, but also how to write history, or how to write our memory. That's important. And I would like to move on to maybe talk about a few of those. Let's see. We have this. This is a volume that unfortunately has not been translated, but I want to. This is a volume that is typical of those years too, because it was a symposium that we organized with writer Jose Luis Gonzalez and some of the younger scholars of the time, Ricardo Campos from Centro, the beginnings of Centro, Juan Flores, who was also beginning at Centro in those years, and Ángel Quintero Rivera, who was a member of CEREP. And I did the introduction, I organized that symposium. It says Princeton because I had just been invited to Princeton for a year, and we were able to organize that symposium there. And I want to mention it also because it was one of the very first essays written about a book that I want to devote more time, and it's the book by Bernardo Vega, Memoirs. This was, the book by Bernardo Vega had just been published in Spanish, and this book has a very important essay, one of the very first essays on that Bernardo, and discussions too. And also it has the writer Jose Luis Gonzalez, who was in exile for 20 years. He was not allowed to go back to Puerto Rico because he had been a member of the Communist Party, the Puerto Rican Communist Party, just like Cesar Andreu, and he was persecuted by McCarthyism and decided then to move to Mexico, and he was extraordinary. He did something extraordinary that very few people have done. That is, he gave up his American citizenship and established himself in Mexico and lived there until his death. And although he was allowed to go back to Puerto Rico in 1973 for the first time, but he had left in 1952, so it took 20 years for him to get back to the island because he was listed as a member of the Communist Party. That's one important thing I want to underline today, because we tend to forget the small but very significant Puerto Rican Communist Party. And we will have Bernardo Vega, who was also a sympathizer. We have Jose Luis Gonzalez, but we also will see in Bernardo Vega's book references to many other groups. And also they were Cesar Andreu, who edited Bernardo Vega's book, was also a member of the Puerto Rican Communist Party and played a very important role in the writing of the workers' history in Puerto Rico, and with groups like the Movimiento por Independencia and CEREP also, and also Centro. He played a very important part. He was a novelist, and he wrote a very important novel that has been translated a controversial novel on the Puerto Rican nationalists titled in English The Vanquished, which, by the way, was translated into English by Sidney Mintz, the great anthropologist who knew Cesar Andreu and who knew many other Puerto Rican nationalists. Sidney Mintz tells in that preface how he met some of the Puerto Rican nationalists right here in El Barrio, no? He tells that story in the preface to that novel. Let's see the other ones. No?
Los derrotados.
Los derrotados in Spanish, the vanquished in English. And I want to move to Bernardo, to this. This is the one, El País de Cuatro Pisos. This is the book that was published first in 1980 by Jose Luis Gonzalez. I just want to mention, and please feel free to interrupt at any time, no? And raise your hand if you have any questions, no? 1980, El País de Cuatro Pisos, very much part of the discussion of the new history. There was a desire to create new images of Puerto Rican history. And that's what writers do, no? He had written that wonderful short story, Una caja de plomo que no se podía abrir, which to me is one of his great stories, and a great image, a great metaphor that I find still valid for Puerto Rican history. That box has not been fully opened yet, no? There's still a lot more to be done, and that's a great metaphor. But in 1980, when he came back, then he wrote El País de Cuatro Pisos, right in the midst of the debate for a new history. And it was a very controversial essay in the best sense of the word. I mean, it was debated, read, criticized, used, abused, whatever, and he was very happy that he had played that role. And that essay is an attempt to create a powerful metaphor too. And I think the important, in my view, the important thing about the essay is precisely the plurality, the four stories, no? That is, it's an attempt to create stages in Puerto Rican history, but not only four stages, but also different actors, no? From slavery to the new immigrants in the 19th century, no? Corsos, Mallorquines, British, French, that transformed, non-Spaniards who transformed the island as well, coffee and sugar, no? It's a very important essay. In that sense, he's not a historian, he was not a historian, he was a writer who was very, very interested in history and trying to create a new image that allowed for the changes after 1898 is El Tercer Piso, the third story after 1898, and then the fourth one, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, from the 40s on, let's say Muñoz Marín, from the and the crisis of the fourth story. That's what he. That's the thrust of that essay, El País de Cuatro Pisos, and I want to emphasize the diversity and the plurality because it's not just an attempt to indicate several stages, but also different protagonists and actors, women, slaves, anarchists, socialists, nationalists, and the debate, of course, between socialists and nationalists, because that was a debate and still is in many ways, looking at history. Let's move on to the next one. Maybe I was going to see the Memorias de Bernardo Vega. Yeah, this is the first edition of this great book, and I wanted to spend a little bit more time with this book. For many reasons. It was so important for all of us in that year that it came out. And also because it brings together new history, new memories, migration, the diaspora, and the island. It brings together many, many aspects of those years. The writer, Bernardo Vega, a very prominent Puerto Rican activist, journalist, cigar maker, who arrived in New York in 1916, and then went back to the island for the latter part of his life. A socialist, also a defender of Puerto Rican independence. So he brought together independence and socialism, and Calle and New York. It's a beautiful book that I strongly recommend. Maybe we can just begin there when we talk about the new memory and the new history with that book, beautifully translated into English by Juan Flores. So that's why I thought that this book brings together the new Centro, and César Andreu edited, because Bernardo was never able to complete his book. No? He had all this immense material, chapters and pages written. He had been writing all his life while in New York, a very rich life, and accumulating chapters. And Bernard and César was the editor, and that's a very important book. One could say that this is a book as we know it today. And now, the good news is that now we have access, we will have access maybe to the manuscript, because it has been recovered now. But it's an unwieldy manuscript, as we all know happens frequently when people cannot, let's say, give form to an autobiography, which is not easy. And César became the editor and gave shape to the book. He was a very good friend of Bernardo.
How was it originally published?
It was,
the publisher?
this is it.
Huracan?
Yeah, this is it. This is it. And the original edition had also, that disappeared afterwards, a very long essay, introductory essay by José Luis Gonzalez. And César Andreu had come to New York and had worked at Centro. Centro had sponsored, under Frank Bonilla, when Frank Bonilla was the director of Centro, César was a close friend of Frank Bonilla, and he was here in New York. He came here to work on that edition, and that's how the book came to be. It's a beautiful story too. But Bernardo Vega, this old Puerto Rican socialist, trusted very much. That's the only way, the only thing you can understand is that he trusted César Andreu. He knew that César Andreu was also loyal to his leftist values, and trusted him and gave him the manuscript. And César edited the book. That is, he really gave shape to the book. That's as we know it. And then shortly afterwards, it was translated into English, and I want to maybe to refer to some of those quotes that we have there of the book, because it's a perfectly good example of how a new history and the issues and the topics of the new history needed passionately the passion of discovering a new history when we read that book. And I'm quoting from chapter 1, Divided Arrival. That's a topic I suggested there. Let's see that. First to disembark, this is Bernardo Vega, as edited by César Andreu, and as translated by Juan Flores. No? So it's a beautiful story. Books have their own story, right? And that's interesting. First to disembark were the passengers by boat, traveling first class. He's telling the story of how he got to New York in 1916 by boat, right? Businessmen, well-to-do family, students. In second class, where I was, there were the immigrants, most of us tabaqueros or cigar. We all boarded the ferry that crossed from Staten Island to Lower Manhattan. We sighed as we set foot on solid ground. There, gaping before us, were the jaws of the Iron Dragon, the immense New York metropolis. No? Very important, because he's writing from the point of view of social classes. No? It's not just Bernardo Vega. But from the very beginning, the question is, not just a sort of general migration, but social classes and migration. Not just Puerto Ricanos migrating, but social classes, and how social classes in the very boat were separated, right? And they led a different life too. One thing was to be the elites, the well-to-do, were also visiting and living in New York, but the vast majority came in second class. So we can take that. Also, that will, of course, be the case throughout the 20th century. Puerto Ricans were here, and the first part of the book tells a story in its own way since the 19th century. The large majority, the vast majority of, let's say, Hispanics or Latinos, if we want to use that term retroactively, were Cubans in the 19th century because of slavery and sugar and tobacco too. So there was already a significant community, very wealthy, most of them, not all of them, Cubans in New York, because of sugar because of tobacco since the very early part of the 19th century. So when we say 19th century in Nueva York, that means mainly Cubans, but not only Cubans. And then we have Puerto Ricanos and others who arrive, and other social classes who arrive, especially towards the second half of the 19th century. And many of them were tabaqueros. Tobacco was very important in New York as well. Cigar makers. Not cigarettes, huh? Cigars. Cigarettes were the enemy, actually would become the enemy and would destroy cigar makers later on. But anyway, he arrives in, Bernardo arrives with a background already as a socialist. No? He had been active in the organization of workers in Puerto Rico, like many of the tobacco workers were radicals, no? Many of them, and they were the vanguard, and he's very proud of that. If you read the book, he's very proud of his tobacco workers, his friends, and his tradition, and the readings. They were very learned, they read books, they published a lot too in newspapers, no? And he's very proud of that tradition, a sort of new kind of intellectual. They did not go to universities, they had no need for that. They had their own tradition, and a very well-read tradition too, sometimes even more than those who attended universities. Okay, here we have, how they met also, and this I want to underline that, because it's also like for Puerto Ricans in the island in the 70s, it's also discovering that, as a historian I admire has written, Carlo Ginsberg has written many wonderful books, but he's written, he produced an anthology, and the title is No Island is an Island. No? No island is an island, which is good to remember. I mean, our history, and that was very important in the 1970s too, we are part of a history of modernity. No? Colonialism, empires, wars, migration. No? We are part of a very complex history that has to do with the Cuban Revolution in the 70s, with the Vietnam War, with a history of migration and diaspora, with social classes. This is not just an island. No island is an island. No? We are part of a larger history, and we are crossed by historical currents and conflicts. We still are. No? Just like if you think of, let's say, Latinos today, well, you know, Latinos the history is so complex, no? Spanish Empire, the national histories of the various countries, migration, wars, no? All kinds of injustices and conflicts. It's much more than just one country, even though we tend to identify publicly using the national adjectives, no? Cubano, Puerto Rican, whatever, yes.
Yeah, but I always find, like, I have a gnawing issue about our history on the island, because there's a tendency to remove agency from us and say there was this external fact and there was that external fact and that impacted us, and then we did the, you know, it's always like either a reaction or things that are happening to us. And, you know, I always have like, well, what was our agency in that?
Yeah.
What were we trying to do when we were intercepted by this other event? And
well, this book,
like we're just this thing.
This is a very good book to answer, to begin to answer that. This book is a very good book for that, no? In the sense that Bernardo Vega precisely talks about what Puerto Ricanos did, no? And what they wrote and the role they played, but also their failures. Not just their. It's not just a history of achievements and triumphs. But it's also a history of discrimination. It is also a history of colonialism. It is also a history of fracasos, no? So it's a very nuanced book in that sense, no? And it's also a history. I'm very moved when I read this book. I've used it many times in my own classes, and it's also very powerful because he's always ready for new beginnings. You use that expression today, no? For new beginnings, and Bernardo is also always ready to begin again. And it's also an interesting book because of agency and the politics of alliances, looking for allies. And in the case of Bernardo Vega, the allies would be other socialists in New York, other Puerto Ricans who were not socialists, but where there was a common ground that he could talk to, and also many of the other communities in New York. There are 2 or 3 chapters where he talks a lot about, let's say, Vito Marcantonio, who is an important historical figure for the Puerto Rican and the Afro-American community in those years, and for socialists. He was at one time the only really radical congressman in Washington from this area, precisely. No? And that's something that I always like to underline, because it's very hard today to think of political alliances with Italian Americans and the Latino community. Well, we have a good example there. No? Let's also very important this book, because it's the beginnings of El Barrio, no? And he talks about that, how El Barrio, how they came. Of course, they lived in various places, in Brooklyn and in Manhattan, but he talks particularly about El Barrio. As time went by, the main areas where Puerto Ricans lived changed both in location and social composition. By 1929, the old neighborhood on the east side made up mostly of tabaqueros, no? He's very proud of that always, had moved up toward Harlem, and El Barrio was finally consolidated as the heart of the Puerto Rican community in New York. That's very important. We find there in that book also a memory of the city, and not only of the city in general terms, but specific places that played a role historically, no? Just like later on, Ángel Quintero Rivera, in his other book, Patricios y Plebeyos, will write a very important essay on Ponce, not just San Juan, but Ponce, and the role of Ponce in Puerto Rican life. The different cities, quite different, San Juan and Ponce, no? And quite different, let's say, if you say just New York, I would say El Barrio, and the development of El Barrio, and the memory of a place, of a specific place, and its politics, and its tensions, and its agency, and its possibilities. And he's very proud of that as well. But the Puerto Ricanos were not the only ones. Of course, he's very happy at El Barrio too, because he meets people from all over the world in El Barrio. That's very important there. And I wanted to underline that. But he says also, he adds, living conditions, living conditions far from improving grew worse and worse. Once a building was occupied by our countrymen, no more maintenance was done on it. So it's also a memory of discrimination, abuse, very important in this book. Just like at the time that this book came out, in the 70s, the young lords were saying the same, practically, and doing and acting on it, on discrimination and abuse of the community. That's why this book also came out. It's maybe what I want to say today is that there's always a joy of discovery of the past. The usual, let's say, the usual phrase is, the future is unpredictable. Well, as one poet has suggested, the past is even more unpredictable. Sometimes it's surprising how new the past can be. That happened, I have to say, with slavery. Because in Puerto Rico, in my time as a student, one of the few things that was really stressed about the history of Puerto Rico was abolition of slavery. So we all knew that abolition had taken place, but we never knew about slavery itself. Slavery itself was a mystery. I mean, how did that work? How did that happen? That is still true to a certain extent in the metropolitan centers I'm not here, but in Spain and France, there's very little in schools about the history of slavery itself. Just recently, France acknowledged in a monument, the Haitian struggle for independence. Just the other year, just last year, a few years ago. But we knew very little about slavery. And then 1968, the Centenario de Lares, brought for my generation a renewed interest in Betances and others. Who were they? I mean, we had, sometimes the graphic artists gave us images that we did not have. They created images. They created a memory, a visual memory. Lorenzo Omar, no? His students, Martorell, Jose Rosa, others, they created an image. And images are very important for memory. But also, the same thing happened with slavery. When the celebration of 1973, I still remember that, no? Well, I mean, we had these wonderful posters and images, but we still knew very little about slavery. No? How did it come to be? What are the consequences? How did it work or didn't work? So, in that sense, slavery is a good example too. Slavery is not that prominent in Bernardo Vega's book, but it will be very prominent in El País de Cuatro Pisos and also in Quintero's work and many others, no? Of that. Slavery will become one of those huge topics, still is today. But I think before that period, we find very little about slavery in Puerto Rican history. No? And let's move on maybe to see the other one. Yeah, Vito Marcantonio. Maybe I will stop there. I just wanted to mention Vito Marcantonio.
The one on La Liga Tijana.
Okay, yeah.
Because that
Yes.
has the women, the mixed groups.
Let's go back, yeah. I chose that topic, that quote from La Liga Antillana, yeah, which is right there on chapter 2. Chapter 2, yeah,
The one before,
the one before.
it's chapter 9, page 66. It starts out, it says before that one, La Liga Tijana, there, that one.
Yeah, chapter 9. The Liga Antillana, a similar organization to the Liga de Artesanos, but made up of women, was also formed at the time. Its Cuban and Puerto Rican members belonged to the working class women like Gertrudis de Serra, Josefa González, Dominga Muriel, Ramona Gomero. This book, if you get a chance, if you haven't read it and you read it, you will see one of the characteristics of this book is it's just like a mural of names. It just goes on and on. He has list of names, which sometimes it's overwhelming, but on the other hand, it's so important because I think Bernardo Vega was very self-conscious about that. He wanted to give us names because we had no names.
And this
And
was
names is so
impressive
important.
because, he, it's Jose Martí,
Yeah, Sotero Figueroa.
it's
Yeah,
Josean.
but also lesser known Puerto Rican and Cuban women, no, who had been in the Liga Antillana, and this is the 19th century. So he goes back to the 19th century in Nueva York, and the Liga was not just a political organization. The Ligas were schools, no, and that's very important, and racially too, because it's one of the he's interested in remembering, and remembering is the verb here, how diverse racially that community is by the end of the 19th century in Nueva York. Small, but increasingly diverse, no, racially and socially. So you have a very I think it's a very interesting situation where you have, for instance, Cubans and Puerto Ricanos, black and mulatto in New York post-Civil War and even during the Civil War, who were freed men and freed women. No? That was very unusual too, and that they had political relations with the elite.
Some of them are elite, right?
And some of them are elite too.
Lola
Yeah,
Rodriguez de-
yeah. But they found some common ground in relation to the political movements and the independence movements particularly, and they attended some of these lectures and readings at the meeting halls. In that sense,
But she was an exile.
yeah, but she was still very much a member of the elite. Of course, she was.
Yeah. She was the one that said that Cuba and Puerto Rico
Yeah.
are grains of the same.
She was,
Yeah.
and not Martí, as Cubans say. No? Yeah, she was the one. And so there you have. He's interested in alliances. Here you have, going back, Cubans and Puerto Ricans in the 19th century, and also the racial and gender component. He's very sensitive to that. And at the same way that later on he's going to, let's see the Vito Marcantonio quote, because I don't think we've seen that. Yeah, Vito Marcantonio, where extremely, he devotes a lot of space and time to Vito Marcantonio, and rightly so, because Marcantonio was so important. Now we have a few books and also good essays on Vito Marcantonio and the Puerto Ricans and independentistas and socialistas. Vito Marcantonio, from his first day in office, Marcantonio took on a workload fit for an entire regiment. His offices and campaign headquarters is located at 247 East 116th Street, no?
It's right
No?
down the street.
Down the street. And were swarming with people at all hours of the day. No fewer than 6 languages could be heard: Italian, Spanish, Polish, Hebrew, Hungarian. He was also very happy with that, Bernardo himself, no? He liked this sort of international mix of New York and also of the political movement. Men and women, young and old, will show up with problems of citizenship, health, public assistance, accidents, housing, immigration, and the 1,001 other day-to-day worries that afflict the poor. And there was Marcantonio with his secretaries, each from a different national background, the champion of all of them, doing everything he could to alleviate their difficulties. No? And there's more on Marcantonio in that book. Yes?
It's interesting, you spoke about alliances right after Marcantonio was defeated.
Yeah.
The powers of divide and conquer, very prominent in gringo politics, especially on the mainland, simply felt they threw the propaganda saying that Puerto Ricans were responsible for the defeat of Marcantonio,
Yeah.
which led to the breakup of those alliances, which led to the scapegoating of Puerto Ricans by the Italian residents.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. And also the fact that Marcantonio was really, after the Henry Wallace campaign too, I mean, Marcantonio was denounced as a communist. He was a victim also of McCarthyism, so he was defeated. He died shortly afterwards, no? He died young, but he was really a victim of McCarthyism as well, no? And many of the Puerto Ricans who were his close friends, I also had to be very careful because Marcantonio had been just stigmatized, no? I know that because of a close relation with Marcantonio in part of my family, you know? And he was extremely courageous, but also he was at the end. Well, I think Gerald Mayer, who has written about him, has indicated that he was not, even when he died, the Catholic Church did not allow him to go to the cathedral, no, which is amazing too. That's how bad things were, no, in the 1950s for someone like Vito Marcantonio, and for, of course, it will be very hard for Bernardo Vega himself, who lived much longer. But you're right, no, and this is at the time of the establishment of El Estado Libre Asociado, no? And this is also at the time of the Korean War. So you have there, this period, no? The 1950s, I really think we need to go back to the Cold War, to the 1950s, right after the war, Second World War, no? And what happened to the islands, and to Latin America too, not just the islands, no? In the midst of the Cold War. And the case of Puerto Rico is very dramatic there, because on the one hand, it's presented as a success story, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, and it was in many ways.
It was the era of the Dulles brothers.
Yeah.
One Secretary of State, one head of the CIA.
Yeah, and it was also the period when there's a really built up on naval and military bases in the island too, which is sometimes forgotten. But it's also the nationalist uprising. It's a very complex period, no? Extremely complex, and it's really with the new history of the 70s that some of these topics become are on the table again, no? Because of the Vietnam War, particularly. And then maybe we can move on and see. I just had some dates here, just because of Bernardo Vega's book, but also thinking about José Luis González, El País de Cuatro Pisos. Bernardo Vega, Calle, 85, died in 65 in Puerto Rico. He went back and joined the Movimiento por Independencia and the socialist group at that time. César Andreu, 1915-1976, who was a union leader, who was a writer, a novelist, who was, of course, as a young man, a member of the Puerto Rican Communist Party, and who became very active, especially in the 60s and early 70s again. The date of the abolition of slavery in Puerto Rico, as I said, of which we knew just that phrase, it was abolished, but we didn't know anything else, no? I don't exaggerate there. And of course, the Spanish-Cuban-American War and its consequences, different for the Philippines, for Puerto Rico, and for Cuba. Also the military occupation. I'm interested in that because that also in the 70s and 80s there was a renewed interest in the military occupation. I mean, exactly how did that happen? How did it work? What was the legacy of the military occupation in both islands, no? Because in 1902 there's a republic in Cuba, but it had been military occupied, no? And also in Puerto Rico. And I think that's still a very important topic. After all, we have Guantanamo too. And then the Federation, I think you'll have experts here will be talking about that later on, no? Of the workers' movement and its institutions and its very complex history. But of course, 1917, yes.
La palabra grande me causa un problema también.
Well, we always have, what word can we use?
Impose.
Impose. I agree.
That has to be erased.
Yeah.
Put down impose.
Yeah, well, I accept that. The only thing is that for many, for you and I, and for those of us here, imposed, not for everyone in Puerto Rico, no? So, in that sense, I hesitate always. It's just like when I talk about, there's a very good book that I like very much on the Puerto Rican citizenship. Well, I'm sure you know them. The books that have been published recently on this, and then the question of being a non-incorporated territory, and also, which is also another difficult expression. What is this? Is this a colony? Is this a colony that is presented legally as a non-incorporated territory? Is this because many Puerto Ricans have accepted that situation too? We don't want to give the impression that everyone is opposed to it. But also the other expression that is the title of a very good book, actually, with a collection of essays, Foreign in a Domestic Sense, about Puerto Rican citizenship. Foreign in a domestic sense, which is, I find it difficult to define myself as foreign in a domestic sense, and yet, that complexity is there too, no? But you're right. Granted, gives the impression that it was altruistic, no? And that's, of course, extremely problematic.
Maybe we can use the word transformed into to
Yeah.
What a
middle
note
ground.
at the bottom of the page explaining that.
The good thing is that
Quotes.
the
Put it in quotes.
Yeah. The good thing is that when I use granted, I use quotes would be better because I personally, if I can express my passions, use it ironically.
Oh, okay.
Myself.
So quotes would be.
So maybe quotations would be better.
Yeah,
But not all Puerto Ricans use it ironically.
right.
And I want to be, in that sense, I,
They don't know
it's,
the history.
yeah, yes.
One of the tacit themes is that in 1917 was America's entry into
Yeah,
World
yeah.
War I,
Right.
which is so important, which is so neglected in many
Absolutely,
writings.
absolutely,
So they needed
absolutely,
the troops.
absolutely. And even, and war, and that's part of the new history of the 70s, because war, that's why I opened my comments today with La caja de plomo que no se podía abrir, because war has been a constant. Either recruitment because of citizenship and being forced to fight in imperial wars, or today mercenary wars. No?
In the early 70s, I don't know whether it was René Marquez, but someone wrote a play, Sin Bandera, which was
Yeah.
presented here by the traveling Puerto Rican theater.
And maybe it's an adaptation. I don't remember that one. Yeah, but I want to say that this is very interesting as part of the discussion too, because this was the sort of discussion that I remember having with my friends and colleagues in the 1970s and 80s. It's a very important discussion about the words that we use. No, very important. What words do we use? Words are not innocent. No? So you're right.
Okay, I have something to add to what you said. It was the United States that entered into the war in 1917, not America. Because the United States is
Yeah.
not America. America is not within the borders of the United States. And I believe that, you know, when they call the United States America, then that leaves us, Latin Americans, as being people without a continent.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
should also be corrected.
Yeah, but we have that correction we have to make in many instances where the word is used to represent the whole of America. Yeah, yeah. Whereas Martí used Nuestra América. Yeah.
Gigante al norte.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question about the imposition of English, because I understand that the current governor is trying to now propose mandating that all the schools start teaching in English. And I know at one period in Puerto Rican history, under the openly colonial regime, that English was also imposed. And so I was wondering
And the
if you
language
could,
of education in schools.
Not granted.
excuse me?
And the language of education in schools.
It was
For
from
that period was
1901 to
English.
Yeah, so
1946.
could you know, within this context of talking about words and usage, can you just reflect on that a little bit, like in terms of?
Well, it was the policy. It was the policy of the U.S. government and the colony that English would, and the ideal that English would be the language of schools. And it was, a few books have been written on that. This policy of Americanization. It was not only the language. It failed in many ways. It failed because it was, which is interesting too, because not just because of they didn't have enough teachers, but resistance too, you know, and that here we have the resistance. Many Puerto Ricans were opposed to that too, you know, and there was a significant lawsuit brought too, just like against the sugar companies, also on the question of language. In the island, I'm not talking now about, here it will happen later, but in the island itself, one of the very prominent persons there was Nilita Vientos Gaston, who was a lawyer, and she also dealt with that. I think it was interesting because then the Commonwealth, El Estado Libre Asociado, no, did not make that, and I think that made it acceptable to many people, that English was not mandatory in the schools, and that made a big change. It made it more acceptable. Huh?
Can I ask?
I don't know if that, in the private schools, the story is different, because in the private Catholic schools, English has been the language for a long time. Huh? So it's a very complex history there. It's a very complex history, but it's part of the colonial politics. Yes.
How does that affect the writing about history?
Very good question. Very good question.
That's a good
I don't.
link to your La Memoria Rota.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I wrote a little bit about that in La Memoria Rota
Yes,
too,
yes.
and that's a very good question. It's a difficult question to answer. I can say from my own experience that it was one of the great contradictions of colonial history, and I can witness that, is that I remember that we used a book that had been written, I forget his name now, that was the only textbook used.
El de Miller.
El de Miller, yeah,
Home.
yeah.
What was it called?
So History of Puerto Rico,
but home.
yeah, and then it was translated. So it was not even translated, the view was absolutely colonial. So the question is the language and also the vision, because I'm not saying, I hesitate to say, because then we had some, let's say, scholars and important scholars who were very influential on us too in those same years, that were either from the US or their language was English, who wrote very liberating essays and books for us, no? One of them being Sidney Mintz and others, no? So it's a very good question, because it's, if English becomes the language of history because it's also the language of power and the state, then it's terrible, because the language becomes associated with domination. But English can also be, and has been, a language of liberation. I have a complex answer, no? I have a complex answer there. And right now, I think it is important for all Puerto Ricanos, that's my personal position, we need to read the text, the literature in English and Spanish. Because it just so happens that many of our writers are writing in English, no? Just like many of them are writing in Spanish. My personal view is we need both, because we didn't choose it that way, but it has happened to be that way, which is not the same as saying I accept English as the imperial language. No? Yes?
I just wanted to add to that back in 1898, Victor Selden Clark, he was an economist for the U.S. Congress. And I can't remember his entire quote, but I did add it to an essay that I'm writing that I'm going to use at the United Nations this year, where he says that if you teach Puerto Ricanos English, they will assimilate and accept the values of Americanism, because they are so plastic and so maneuverable that they can mold us into being what they want us to be. And this was written in 1898, and you can find it just about anywhere.
Yeah, well, Albizu Campos knew English perfectly well. He went to, he studied first in Vermont and then at Harvard. It does not seem to have hurt him.
Yeah, but because Albizu was a very
Betances wrote in French.
The reason why I refer to that quote, excuse me, is because when we speak of impositions, here you have an economist who were some of the main reasons why the invasion took place in the Caribbean and so on. And when you reflect back in history, and you can see how the impositions on behalf of the oppressor are beginning to take place in order to form, to mold a people who already have their own idiosyncrasies.
Yep, you're right there. Yes. I think one last question. I have 5 minutes.
Oh, it's too bad. It's like really, I think language is a really heavy issue, but I would compare it to the colonial language policy that was imposed, not just in Puerto Rico, but also in the Philippines.
Oh, yes.
And I don't know Cuba so much.
Oh, yes.
But I know, so in the Philippines it's very successful because they were able to stomp out pretty much Spanish. And so you have like the indigenous languages, and Tagalog is, of course, their national language, but still in the courts, English is the spoken language. And it's kind of like the lingua franca in a way.
Yeah. But of course, in the Philippines, there were many other languages.
Yes, I mean the indigenous languages. But in PR, it was met with, I guess, a substantial amount of resistance that it was withdrawn under Muñoz Marín. He was the one that sort of withdrew it as the mandatory language.
Yeah. In that sense, I think like Aimé Césaire, the poet from the Martinique and poet and politician, like Fanon, like Ciara James from the Caribbean. I mean, we need to know the imperial languages. One thing is to know them and to use them. And also when you have a large diaspora. What Caribbean country does not have a huge diaspora these days? Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominicans. So we need to know those languages, just because history has moved in that direction, and I want to be able to have my granddaughter read Pedro Pietri, and to read Julia de Burgos, and to read Nicolás Amor.
Yeah, that's Spanglish.
Yeah. Do we have time for one more question back there? Yes.
Rolling is good.
I just wanted to say, mention that, yeah, English is a powerful language because it's a language of lies, because it's the language of corporate media. And all you have to do is watch the news, right? And
I was talking about that before, you know.
I got you late.
Yeah. No, I mean, just privately.
And it's also the language of the Walking Dead. In fact, the most, the big program on TV that maybe a lot of people in this audience see,
Yeah.
is basically about
Yeah.
people that are not thinking.
But it's also the language.
That's what I think English
Yeah. It's also the language of Juan Gonzalez, who has just republished his Harvest of Empire. It's also the language of Amy Goodman, who talks about things that we have, and it's also the language of Walt Whitman, and it's also, So in that sense, the great scholar, Palestinian scholar Edward Said used to say, English empires connect. They don't just oppress, they also connect. And that, I prefer that complexity too, because there's a lot to be said in that direction. As far as the media, we were just talking about that before we started, I am shocked every day by the lies and the silence, and that's why I call vulgarity, just the vulgarity of the lies and the silencing, and the vulgarity of the way they represent Latinos and immigrants and the war against immigrants in English, right? I am shocked every day. And you feel so powerless sometimes in relation to all those lies. But there are many lies in Spanish too. Okay.
Como dijo la reina Isabel, when she was given the first dictionary of the modern language, she said, what am I going to do with this? She said, and I forgot his name. The scholar said to her that he said, language is the instrument of empire.
Nebrija, Antonio de Nebrija. Yeah, no, but it's this is a very important topic. It is, and it will be a very important topic. No, it is. Just a footnote. Talking about slavery, one thing that we did not know when we were so ignorant about slavery: African cultures in the island. So I went through a whole system of education, university system, not one word about African languages and African cultures.
It's a nice
Shocking.
So we need to know it, but we need to resist it.
Yeah, but also we need to, because, what I'm saying here is I've never done this, and I hope I don't have to, because I want to be a Puerto Rican in that sense. I do not want to, it's a question of rights too, and the rights of a community to its own memory and history. I have never, and I hope I will never do it, celebrate in a sort of a critical way the Spanish language either, because Spanish was also an empire. So I don't want to celebrate it, I just use it as best as I can.